Good afternoon. As I was mentioning, my name is Ciprian Popoviciu. I go by Chip. I've been doing V6 for a very long time, and had the opportunity to work on both deployments and on protocol development. So it's been a very interesting experience so far. Definitely is getting much more exciting now with a lot more interest. A few years back, we were kind of looking crazy, all of us there. So our company is called NIFOS6. We are a services company. We have actually two practices. NIFOS stands for cloud in Greek, and I'm not Greek. And 6 stands obviously for IPv6. So we focus on both V6 and cloud. And the reason we decided to do that is because on our experience doing both, we realized that there are actually very interesting correlations between approaching the two problems at the same time. And let's face it, cloud is it's sort of the big brother here in the discussions nowadays. IPv6 is much more of a stepchild, I think, for the time being. But the reality is, I think organizations will realize more and more that they need to approach the problem at the same time. We have a very experienced team that did a lot of V6 work and cloud work, and I believe experience is extremely important going forward for every one of us. So my topic today is maybe a little bit light, if you would, training. And I would say it's light for most of us or most people who are thinking, who pick up a book and pick up an RFC or jump into a lab and start playing with things. I came to realize in time that actually training is one of those very critical aspects that people forget about or don't pay enough attention to in the planning process, and typically turns out to be a very expensive proposition down the road. And so what I would like to do in my presentation is to give you as much insight as possible from my experience about the value of training in the V6 transition. And this discussion is going to tie a lot into trial, so I'm going to lay it out on the roadmap. And at the same time, I want to provide also the larger context when it comes to V6 and training. So first off, the picture of the world, the vision of the world. We do believe that today we are in very interesting times. So we are facing, in the IT world, we are facing three major inflection points. We are facing an inflection point at the infrastructure level. Is this transition to IPv6 that we are all here about, and we are all here to learn more about. And that transition, and that inflection point, it's all about scalability. It's really about scaling our infrastructure, scaling our environment. And on top of that, you have this inflection point, which we hear a lot in the news about, which is cloud. Very overloaded term, oftentimes misunderstood or misinterpreted. Nevertheless, very powerful discussion point nowadays. And in my perspective, really, cloud is all about agility. I know we are pitching it for cost savings, but I really don't think that's really the end goal. And yet, on top of it all, it's this incredible flux or influx of applications. Was talking with an architect from Disney who was saying that across the entire Disney group, all Disney properties, they are putting out about 2.5 applications a day. And so really to get to the point where you have the time to capability with this type of influx of applications and really make them successful and support the business, you really have to have an infrastructure and an IT environment that can sustain that level of those types of life cycles. The key here is that these three inflection points are correlated, they are complex, and they touch every aspect of IT and of the IT environment. And so I think it's very important for us to be mindful in our planning to approach them in a sort of concerted way. It's not just about process, it's not just about planning. There are also technological reasons why it's good to look at the problem or the two problems or all these three problems together. What I would define or put here as a common denominator is complexity. IT organizations are facing more and more complexity. The one thing that is kind of interesting, you know, if you've been in the V6 world for a while, you know, it was great some time back when it was all about the scare tactics to push people to V6. You know, we ran out of the global IPv4 address pool, so that kind of was proven, and we are all happy about that, sort of. And what's really exciting is to see that organizations and people now are starting to shift their sort of internal drivers or their perspective on V6 away from that scare of the address exhaustion, which is real and is still the main driver. But they start to shift towards understanding that this inflection point, this transition to IPv6, is really a great opportunity to actually change things in the IT world, to actually really set the ground for your next generation infrastructure, to really make that once in a career transformation of your workplace, of your business infrastructure. And so this is a survey that Cisco published, I believe, in April. And I just highlighted there a few of the key aspects which show this shift in the perspective that CIOs have about IPv6 and the importance of the IPv6 transition. Okay, so now let's talk about the overall context. So we talk about trials and we talk about training. Where do all these things fit? All these things fit into the larger strategy that we have to put together in order to drive and execute successfully on our IPv6 strategy. And so, in my mind, there are 5 phases of the transition process, of the strategy. We start with the discovery process. We all know we need to have a little bit of an understanding of where we want to go and where we are at high level. We get into the strategy portion where we talk about architectures that we're going to pursue for our next generation environment, and we'll see how all these fit in the context of IPv6. We know the end goal. We know where we are. This way we can assess the readiness of our environment as far as V6 is concerned. And so now we can plan. We can plan our deployment. We can start figuring out what will be the exact next steps as we move along into the process. And finally is the implementation. So we can do V6 overnight at a very high cost, or we can do this over time, which means a lot of correlation in terms of activities. And that's why I think that IPv6 is going to be a challenge to a certain extent because of the knowledge gap and because of the new technologies that are popping up, but also because this need to orchestrate across all the organizations within the IT environment. But trials will happen, in my mind, in my experience, trials happen throughout this process. Let's say minus discovery, maybe. So the definition of trials can be very refined as we go through this process. And you can try with something that is very simple, a very simple lab that you evaluate aspects of the protocol, you evaluate a particular implementation of the protocol stack. But you can go all the way towards implementation where you start to really evaluate solutions at a system level, at a really high scale. We were talking about POCs, CPOCs, and other resources out there. You can build only so big of a test bed in order to test things. You cannot really replicate everything that you have to scale into your environment or into a test environment. Just to set aside the fact that test tools are some of the test tools still have to catch up on the abilities to provide the test resources to do your testing. So trials really happen throughout the process. And as we'll see, I see this process of trials and evaluations as being very cyclical. You really have to iterate a lot as we go through this IPv6 process, simply because vendors are coming up to speed as needed. Features are changed, and protocol implementation changes, and the requirements and standardization changes. So let's first see who we should train as far as V6 is concerned. In my mind, you have 2 major dimensions, two major sort of groups, if you would, in your organization. You're going to have the infrastructure guys, for whom V6 is a very natural and immediate fit from a perspective of where the protocol sits on the stack. And one of the key aspects of training and preparing for the transition is, as I'll mention later, is that we need to provide the right knowledge to the right people at the right time. And so in the context of infrastructure, definitely you need to start with architects in order to get them up to speed in terms of how they can leverage the protocol beyond the obvious. And one thing that it's absolutely essential is that throughout this transition process to IPv6, this is the time and the right approach is to actually harvest the institutional knowledge and experience within the organization. Because that's the only way you can actually build towards your next generation infrastructure that will meet the needs of the business and the organization, and you take care of the experience gained running the environment for all these years. And so it's important to train everybody and get their input. And start with architects, move into the design, because you want to get the design team up to speed in order to both build standards, but also to evaluate solutions. And then move into the implementation team, and finally to operations. And obviously, the circles reflect group and size of groups of people. And now, throughout this process, some domains here might be within your organization, some might be outside of the organization, depending on how you run your IT environment. And then on the right-hand side there, I sort of try to summarize a few of the domain knowledge that should be conveyed during the process of training. What we really want to start, when we start with architects, what we really want to convey to them is the deep understanding of the protocol. I'll mention this also in a little bit here, that really IPv6 is not your father's IP. I mean, at the first iteration, it looks very similar, but there are very important differences that are fundamental to how the protocol works and some of the concepts that are fundamental to the protocol. So we need to make sure that at least the architects who are building the target architecture for the organization understand those concepts. And then you need to get to designers with the knowledge transfer, because, as was mentioned a little bit earlier, check marks and check boxes that are filled in that says that the product or a solution is IPv6 ready are good only to the point where you are very, very specific of what you're expecting and what you want to do with them. And that's why it's important to be able to understand what type of requirements, specifically what type of requirements you have on products and on solutions, and how do you and actually evaluate them. Now, this is another very important group of people, application folks. You know, in one of the organizations that I worked with in the past, I mentioned IPv6 to the application team, who was very excited about getting their application ready for IPv6. I mentioned IPv6. I mean, there was absolutely no understanding of the concept of IPv6, no understanding of anything related to IPv6. And so even if you go ahead and create a trial, a lab, an infrastructure where these guys can start to play, you need to prime them up a little bit. Because I had folks that said, oh, no problem, just give me the equipment, I'm going to go and start to install my application and get things ready. They did not know how to bring up their resources from a connectivity perspective and what to do with them. And so it's very important to start this awareness campaign and knowledge transfer for application teams relatively early. And again, you need to keep in mind two perspectives here. On one hand, you want to have these guys start to think from a V6 perspective, start to build you know, this self-controlling points related to how to develop applications, how to integrate into the middleware, what requirements they should have in the middleware, and so on. But at the same time, what I've seen is that it's important to get the architects, the application architects, mindful of the IPv6 capabilities, because they do come up with different approaches and the different development standards for their organization and for their applications based on what they understand around IPv6. So what type of knowledge should we transfer? And this is a very qualitative and not necessarily a law or prescriptive method on what knowledge to transfer. All I wanted to convey with the slide was that it has to be a build-up process. Like everything else, if you dump all the knowledge in one shot on folks and you do not have a very clear plan on how they will start to get familiar with the knowledge that was provided, very quickly you lose all that investment that you made in training. From what I've seen when we did knowledge transfers, and sometimes formal knowledge transfer, sometimes informal knowledge transfer, it's important to start with the basics. It's important to start with addressing, because this is going to have ramifications throughout the organization, throughout all your test environments, throughout all the teams that are going to be involved in the process. Basic operation of the protocol, very important, because that will enable them to actually become self-sufficient in running their environments, test environments. Provisioning considerations, everything from DHCP and Slack and DNS and so on. Transition, because inevitably people will have to deal with the transition process. But then, while you start to get more in-depth with the infrastructure, again, application knowledge. What are the things that need to be considered when you do application evaluation for V6 readiness? What are the things that they should be considering in terms of defining new architectures for applications? I have their testing, and it's pretty high up on that ladder, but I would say that testing is an area that it's very tricky, because testing V6 is not like testing IPv4. It's important to understand how to test V6 both from a functional perspective, but also from a performance perspective and from a scalability perspective. And obviously, you also have here that fine twist, right? Because it's not just about testing V6 and comparing it with V4, which is our immediate tendency. It's about testing V6 against expectations, against sort of more absolute expectations, so not necessarily go for relative terms. But also what's interesting is that it's very important and it's inevitable that you have to test things in a coexistence scenario. Because ultimately you have to run a business, and you need to have, to a very good extent, some level of expectations of what will be the impact of rolling on V6 into your environment. Where are the things that you need to be careful of? What type of resources you should be mindful of conserving? So how to train? Well, I've seen people go through this typical cycle. First iteration is, IPv6 is just like IPv4, straightforward, I got it. And that's good, because that doesn't scare people away. But at the same time, that really lends organizations to the strategy of matching into V6 what they did into V4. Everywhere from simply matching the V4 address space into V6, which is a terrible idea, and then features, designs, and architectures. Everything goes one-to-one. That is definitely not a good strategy, because you miss the opportunity to do things the right way, and you really are going to drive the wrong message with the vendors as well. My recommendation is, if you know what you want from your IT environment, you most likely are not going to be exclusively about parity. And I would rather have folks go and ask vendors to build new capabilities than just drive parity for the sake of parity. Second iteration is to actually get a little bit more into depth about understanding V6, and I would recommend this to anybody. I did it the same way. Learn the first wave of V6, go back and go in depth into the control plane, into functionality, into capabilities. And once you go the second time around, you will understand a lot more about some of the fundamental assumptions that are made within the protocol and how the protocol is implemented. And then, finally, is the tie-in that I was mentioning earlier. Really tie in V6 and the understanding of V6 with the other technologies that are relevant and key in your IT environment, as I was mentioning, cloud. Because now, in that context, you will be able to leverage the V6 knowledge into cloud. You will be able to really come up with a design for cloud, for a cloud infrastructure that can actually scale much better than you do it with V4. And then at the same time, you have the ability to drive the right type of requirements. We were talking about IPAMs a little bit earlier. Drive IPAM requirements that not only reflect IPv6 needs, but also tie IPv6 needs into the cloud needs and how they will operate into the next generation environment. I don't see Ron here, but I think he says that oftentimes. Doing it is absolutely critical. So theory is nice, books are nice. They get wrong from time to time. I have 2 books, and I have mine need some updates. So all that is good. Theory is great. Following RFCs is great. Doing it in the lab makes the whole difference in the world. And that's for many reasons. Once you sit down and you see things work, you understand them better. You see them in a context, specifically in your context, and from your eyes, your experience. Second, things change. I mean, things really constantly change in this environment. It is a live protocol, like IPv4, continues to evolve. And implementations continue to get refined. Innovation starts to penetrate into the implementation. And so, in one case, for example, we started with something that was very small. Actually, that whole thing was set up in a closet. Very simple, few servers, very simple equipment. And that was sufficient to actually get a few folks up to speed on the basic functionality, the basic capability of the protocol. It was a great way to get things started. It was not matching anything or very little out of the actual environment. But it was a very easy way for us to get the team or get a few people interested, a playground. Then you move into a little bit more of a complex environment, particularly if you have an environment that is already being used for some type of trialing or some type of development. Inserting a V6 component into that becomes a little bit of an easier proposition, and it serves the original purpose of that environment. So you can build an infrastructure that is much more reflecting the reality into which you can expand your testing scope. And finally, you get into more and more complex scenarios where you start to mix both aspects of your infrastructure that relate to access and aspects of your infrastructure that relate to service delivery in data centers and so on. And so I really believe that you should not wait until you can build this big, beautiful test environment. You should really take it step by step. Moreover, these little steps along the way actually are valuable because sometimes you do have to go back and you do have to leverage a smaller set of resources in order to test something, a recent development or something new that came up and needs to be reevaluated. The one thing that I want to point out is building an infrastructure or a test environment according to your current environment is, in my mind, a little bit less valuable than building an environment that matches where you're going. You really need to think that you're not thinking just about enabling what you have today. You need to think about the fact that you're enabling your next generation architecture. And so to a certain extent, that might be the case. To a certain extent, you might have that in the process of development, so you can leverage that and test in that context. But that should be the goal. And so, for example, in this case, when we got to deploy into the data center or create the zone in the data center that was dual stacked enabled, we did enable an environment that was representing the next generation data center and not what was currently in place. A few thoughts on maximizing the ROI for training. I'm a firm believer of doing the right training for the right people at the right time. You take a bunch of folks from the organization and you put them in a set of classes, and by the time they really get a chance to use the knowledge or to apply the knowledge, they might have lost it. And so it's good to have a perspective, to put in place a plan that gives you an idea when these resources are going to start to come into picture with the right type of feedback, with the right type of contributions, and prep them up as it goes and as you move along the way. Plus, it's a little bit easier to tailor knowledge around the interests and the experience of those particular groups. So you have a track for architects. You deliver a certain type of knowledge for architects, and you have another track for deployment folks and different track for implementation folks. I think that a well-prepared strategy that lines up with the test resources that you want and the test exercise that you want to execute on, it's going to save a lot of money out of this training investment overall of the transition. Also, in terms of maximizing your ROI, I also believe that this is a field that is constantly changing, and this is a field that, let's face it, does not have best practices. We have large deployments, we have case studies, but we don't really have best practices. We are really developing, we're in the process of developing best practices. And so I really believe that the type of training that you want to go after is training that is dynamic, it continues to evolve. It's not your standard discussion about the basic stuff and so on. You want to really start to build up around, to leverage knowledge that is built by folks that have expertise, that has relevancy to your domain and to the actual implementation of or deployment of the protocol. It's insightful, so it's based on experience of actually doing deployments, not based on reading a book or something that you can do at your own pace anyway. And as I mentioned earlier, theory and hands-on, extremely important. It really makes a big difference if you actually played with the protocol rather than just read about it. When to start, and this is very important again, you should have the roadmap as soon as possible. You should have a clear vision of how your organization is going to evolve in terms of readiness from a knowledge perspective. You should have that in place as soon as possible. Because the sooner you start, the easier it's going to be for you to leverage train-the-trainer type of concepts and to build on the knowledge and the critical mass that is being created from the get-go. So start early, have a plan for it, make sure that it aligns with the strategy of the transition. And to conclude, you hear various opinions as you sit through a conference or listen to or read throughout the internet. You have different opinions of what the protocol is and what the protocol is all about. My personal belief is that really is not IPv4. IPv6 is not really IPv4. It's not your father's IP. So this is why I believe that it's very, very important to actually sit down and understand what the protocol is all about, what are some of the assumptions that have been made, what are some of the fundamental concepts that the protocol has been built on. There are things that we could have done better. There are things that we did pretty well. And there are things that we're going to improve. The important thing is understand before, realize that certain things are very similar to before, so you're going to feel comfortable with those key aspects, but then go back, revisit, get more in-depth understanding of what's going on. Without a doubt, IPv6 touches every aspect of IT. And whether you realize it now or you realize it later, it's a fact. Remember that when you do an IPv6 transition, in my experience with customers, it's never a first shot win kind of a deal. You always have a few optimization steps along the way. And through that process, inevitably, the customer comes to the realization that the IPv6 transition is going to touch many aspects of IT. And that's why it's important to involve everybody into the learning process and to contribute to the strategy and building the trials, building the transition process. Transition is going to take time. As I said, it's an iterative process. You learn more things as you go along. Products are changing along the way, and so I do believe that you should expect this process to last for a longer time. How long the transition is going to be, we heard a little bit earlier that we start to come to the right realization that running two protocols at the same time is not a cheap proposition. So it's good to, it's probably times are going to be shorter than we expect in terms of the dual stack transition, dual stack operation. And finally, not all IPv6 training is created equal. You really need to think through, to build around expertise and leverage this type of events, leverage experience that was built around actual deployments rather than just textbook knowledge. Any questions? All right, great.